Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of StreamTime Sports. I'm your host Nick Meacham and thrilled to be joined once again by my colleague Steve McCaskill. Welcome back, Steve.
Thrilled to be here.
Now, lots to dig into today. I wanted to get you back on because there's always a lot going on in our industry, but seems to be lately, not just in the US, but indeed all markets, there is plenty of big announcements, big deals, and that could have potentially big ramifications for what's going on in our respective different sectors that we cover. So really wanted to spend some time talking about Apple. But before we dig into Apple, I have to ask you a big question. What's your thoughts on power slapping?
I mean, my personal slogan, it's a bit like, ESPN 8, the Ocho, obscure sports coarsely from Dodgeball. If it's almost a sport, we'll cover it. That's kind of my attitude in terms of what I watch, but I think power slap may be too far. I think I've seen about 10 seconds of it, and it was enough for me. It might appeal to a certain demographic, but I've seen some after pictures of some of the participants, and it's not for me. I've got a lot of time for certain combat sports, got a lot of time for boxing. I believe they do a lot of social good, which offsets the damage that the competitors are doing to themselves. I think it teaches discipline, creates it can be a productive channel for aggression. I don't see any of that in power slap at all. And I've got no interest in deepening my knowledge of it.
Well, that is a pretty robust response there, Stephen. I think I get your take. I do find it pretty weird to watch. And for those that are listening and haven't heard of power slap, it's actually something I don't know if it's something that he came up with, but it is one of the leading voices and faces of power slap is Dana White, who obviously founded the UFC, and he's taken a pretty lead role in growing that as a sports property. And I don't know much about the detail, but my God, it keeps popping up in my various social media feeds. And I'm even now trying to swipe faster so I don't keep getting served this stuff. But I think I must have watched too much at one stage. I keep getting served more and more, or I have this penchant somehow subconsciously of watching really big bearded men getting slapped really hard, but I can't get away from this stuff. So I had to check to see what your take was, because I've heard Dana actually talk on a podcast recently about it, and he's all in. He thinks it's got the next big thing, and I really can't see it going past being more of a great social clippable sort of product. Anything more than that, and it's pretty rough stuff.
I mean, I'm sure there's some skill involved. I'm sure there's a fair amount of training the competitors have to go through. Not demeaning any of that, but yes, I won't be tempting my algorithm to be presenting me with power slap content. That's for sure.
Well, what other stuff will you be powering your algorithms to watch more lately, Steve? Is there any recent sports events you've tuned into, perhaps that are really something that's caught your eye? Because I know, and we've talked about this on the last pod, that you do have quite a wide-ranging interest of sports, which is always something I'm appreciative of. I wouldn't say jealous of, but definitely appreciative of. It always overwhelms me with the number of sports you're across.
Well, the thing that's captured my attention most recently is actually quite mainstream, given my interest, and it is football. And it's my hometown team, Maidstone United, have become they're the first sixth-tier club to reach the fifth round of the FA Cup in England, I think, since 1978. When Blythe Spartans from the northeast made the same stage of the competition, and it's been absolute magical run. I won't bore you with the history, but I'm from Maidstone. Kent is a bit of a footballing backwater. We have one league club in the form of Gillingham, and Maidstone United are actually the last club to go bankrupt and fail to complete an EFL season before Bury 5 years ago. And they led a nomadic existence. They bounced around the non-leagues, lots of financial uncertainty, until a group of really wonderful individuals brought the club back home in 2012. They're now in National League South, which is again the sixth tier. They've been as high as the fifth tier. They've gone through, I think it's 7 or 8 games to reach the fifth round. They beat Ipswich, who are flying high in the championship, in the fourth round, which was one of the best sporting events I think of my life. It was absolutely brilliant. And unfortunately, they lost to Coventry City 5-0, which I must admit I think flattered Coventry, who were obviously the better team, but Maidstone gave a good go of it, gave a good account of themselves, and it's been an absolutely enjoyable thing to watch, and really good to see Maidstone in the headlines.
I mean, Maidstone United. I mean, of all the, you follow a lot of sports. I know I've seen you in various shirts at work, supporting different teams from across the world. I didn't actually know you had Maidstone running through your blood, Steve. I know you had a lot of other nationalities and regions. Interesting. Well, there you go. There's another one. But how many would you classify them as? Are they a professional team, semi-pro?
Semi-professional. So at the sixth tier, it's hard to maintain professionalism at that level. There is a small TV deal for the National League, but that's more for the Premier League. The National League. The top tier of the National League, they see the money come through. Although Maidstone has always been a well supported club, at least it has been since it returned to the town, and they took 5,000 fans up to Coventry, which filled a whole end of the Coventry Building Society Arena as it's now known. And
what a name!
5,000 fans from a 26,000 attendance, I believe. That's pretty good going. So. Semi-professional, but with aspirations to be higher.
Absolutely. And for those that are American, have no idea what at scale the sixth league is. Well, Wrexham is at League Two, so a couple of divisions below them.
Yeah, Wrexham are fourth tier, Maidstone are sixth tier. But I'd also like to point out that another Kent club, Gillingham, who I referenced earlier, they beat Wrexham at the weekend. So Kent football, could be on the way up.
Good stuff. Well, there you go. Another sporting team that you follow. So I don't know how many there is now, Steve, but I want to get that full list run down one day because it is an impressive piece of work. Sorry to interrupt your podcast, but if you haven't heard, we are heading to Manhattan for SportsPro New York. On the 18th and 19th of March, you can hear from industry innovators such as LPGA Tour Commissioner Molly Marcoux Samaan, SVP of ESPN Plus, John Lasker, CEO of Fubo TV, David Gandler, and Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark, to name but a few. Come to be inspired and learn how to successfully navigate the major opportunities in modern sports media. Book your place today at newyork.sportspro.com, and listeners to this podcast can get 20% off by using the code PODCAST at checkout. Terms and conditions apply, and this offer is not applicable to pre-existing purchases. But let's talk about, speaking of impressive pieces of work, sort of a segue, is Apple's new app that they've just launched, the Sports app. Now, it feels like that is something that's been long in the making for those like us who follow the goings on in the industry, given Apple's work to this point around Apple TV and then their investment in the MLS, the much talked about 10-year, $2.5 billion deal that has got a lot of coverage because of its global nature as much as exclusivity that Apple has. So what's your take on this announcement? They put a lot of PR stardust into this. There's a lot of effort that's gone into marketing the fact that Apple has this new sports product. What's your view, Steve? You've produced a newsletter, a great newsletter that everyone should subscribe to on the SportsPro website around what's going on in it's a fortnightly newsletter, if I'm not mistaken, Steve. And this week you focused on Apple's new app as the core story there. So please do go subscribe to that. But what's your take on the new Apple Sports app?
Well, it looks nice. That's pretty much my first impression. You wouldn't expect anything less from Apple, but it's pretty threadbare. And the level of functionality it has feels very disproportionate to the amount of PR that has begun that is behind it, which leads me to believe it is just a placeholder for something bigger. It's a scores app. It's got a selected number of leagues and competitions. It's got some stats. It's got some betting information, and in certain markets it will link you to the relevant streaming service, which I'll come on to more of that, which I think is the most significant element of it. But in terms of functionality, it's not offering anything new. It's no different from the scores apps that have been around since the dawn of the App Store, Live Score, One Football, that sort of thing, or even what the broadcasters will have themselves. I mean, Sky Sports, BBC Sports, but BBC Sport will offer this service. So it's nothing unique in what it's offering. And to be honest, in terms of the leagues it supports, I mean, for example, you wouldn't be able to see the FA Cup score involving Maidstone United because it's not one of the supported competitions. The NFL isn't supported because it's out of season. So it's there. It's on people's devices. It looks nice. It's very it works well. I don't really know what the long-term goal for this application is, but it does fall in line with Apple's other efforts in its space. So, for example, in many ways, it's tempting to see sport as a new Apple service rather than its own thing. It's got news apps, music, television, and these are all designed to get people to spend more time, spend more money within the Apple ecosystem. They're more likely to buy new iPhones, spend more on services and subscriptions. So the end business goal of sport isn't quite as apparent as those other forms of entertainment. But I think it's a first step towards potentially becoming an aggregating force, or potentially becoming a platform that will entice sports fans to spend more time in the Apple ecosystem rather than, quite obviously, the Android ecosystem, but also connected TV system, more of another broader tech ecosystem like Amazon or something like that. So first step towards something else. Normally I wouldn't be that interested in something like this, but A, it's Apple, and B, they have put a fair bit of PR behind it, which makes me think it is something worth watching.
I did wonder, and you never know quite what's behind a story in terms of what sort of PR machine is there. Is it because there's just industry interest? Is there because there's a lot of work behind the scenes from Apple's team to drive it? Historically, whenever Apple has launched a product, generally, whether particularly on the hardware front, there's always mass hysteria with regards to what is it, and normally everyone gets excited about the corner of the phone being a different shape or something. Like, everyone gets excited about very little minor details in the grand scheme of things. So I do wonder whether there's a little bit of that here versus providing anything more, like being a placeholder. Doesn't seem like it's what normally Apple would do when they're announcing something. If it's of a significance, they would normally be launching something to hit the market with a bang. But it could be something they also want to launch, something that's more of an editorial type product, to see what engagement's like from a sports audience perspective, and seeing, so get people set up, I suppose, to start marketing them, more sports related content, the MLS product, and anything else they might bring into the mix once they've nailed that. So it could be very much as much of a learning exercise, I suppose, as a product they've got like a huge roadmap mapped out for.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. Apple's in the past has been no stranger to releasing things fairly early in let's say, its overall life cycle. I mean, look, about a decade ago, Apple Maps launched, and it was widely panned because it lacked a lot of the functionality that was in Google Maps. People wondering, why are you doing this? And in the long run, that's proved to be a very shrewd decision. I mean, Apple Maps is now a lot better, but obviously, in terms of how we're seeing the shift to connected cars, it's been a masterstroke. And over time, Apple's learned how people have used it. They've got access to a lot of data. They've added new features. Apple Music, when it launched, it was essentially what was Beats' own streaming service that provided the foundation for that and a lot of the licensing. Apple Music lacked, and to a degree still lacks, some of the features of Spotify, although it does offer other things in terms of audio quality that audiophiles like. And I prefer Apple Music to Spotify for the record, but it took time to build out that proposition. So, and even Apple TV Plus, that started out fairly modestly. It's now gotten a more expanded catalogue of content, but I wouldn't say they've blown or tried to blow the competition out of the water. So it's got a history of starting out small, building things up, getting it on as many devices as possible, perhaps showing potential partners what it can do, or users what it might be able to do. And there is a degree of Apple's, for want of a better term, it's I'm going to call it its fervent fan base rather than cultishness. I think that's a fairer thing to say. People use it because it's Apple. I've seen things on on LinkedIn in particular, people going, a lot of hot takes about this application and where it might be going. And I don't know if that was because some people want to be seen as ahead of the curve or early adopters, but there's no logical evidence for some of these hot takes. I'm just putting that out there. But it's people do get excited about what Apple does, and there's all sorts of ways it can I guess cross application opportunities as well. Things like Apple Music, things like the Fitness Plus app. There's a lot of possibilities here, and yeah, it's one of those examples where if it was someone else, wouldn't be as excited or even that interested, or writing a whole newsletter about it. Because it is Apple, because they have this impact on the markets they operate in, it's definitely worth taking notice of.
So just in terms of access, I think you might have mentioned it, but just to be clear on it, is it on everyone's device now? Do you have to download it like any new app? And did you mention it might be available on connected TVs as well?
No, so it's only available, I believe, in the UK, the US, and Canada at the moment. You download it from the App Store. There are plans to roll out to more geographies, and I'm not sure about the connected TVs just yet. But I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that we pass to future iOS versions and updates, perhaps some more integrated features on devices. One important thing to note is that Apple now knows or would like to know your sports teams, your favorite sports teams, and it uses those across multiple applications. So it's in your news. If you use Apple News, it's in there, and sports in there. So again, it's a data gathering exercise, I suppose, as well, to understand more about people who use its products. And again, that could be very useful for a potential partner, if it's a league or a club or brand or whatever.
Absolutely. So a couple other things I wanted to talk about with Apple is I'm not sure how much you've looked at this, Steve. I'm sure, knowing your background and knowing your interests, I'm sure you've had a look at the Vision Pro that they've launched. Any sight as to what they're doing on sports, and if there's something there that's really got some substance behind it, or is it just another example of VR mixed reality experience that's same but different to what we've seen in the past iterations of VR sort of devices, the headsets?
I think it's probably the most exciting extended reality headset that's come on the market so far. It may not be the most advanced. I think that there's a lot to like about what Meta's been doing in Meta Quest in terms of since it acquired Oculus. That will also benefit from Apple's doing. But Apple has this ability to galvanize a category in a way that other companies just can't, whether that's through user adoption, whether that's through developer support. We've seen it with smartwatches. We've seen it with the smartphone, arguably, and we've seen it when it created a whole new category with the iPad. So that's why Apple's entry is exciting. It creates desirable products that people want to use, and because it has this tight integration of hardware and software, it gets that developer support. It gets those use cases. It gets people want to use it. And we're sort of seeing that with Vision Pro already, both from first-party and third-party efforts. Because it's, again, MLS is kind of a proof of concept what Apple can do with sport. If it can have comprehensive global rights, it's already created a Vision Pro experience. I think it's the best bits from last year's playoffs are now available in 8K, immersive. Again, the industry needs to think of a better word than experience, because I'm struggling to describe something. It's more of an application. It's more than a video. It's an immersive experience, and so that's available if you have stumped up I think it's the $3,500 that this Vision Pro costs. You can access it. But then there's been some third-party support. PGA Tour, NBA, MLB have all said they're going to create, again, experiences for the Vision Pro. Lots of these are sort of, I guess, VR or data-driven. But then the other really neat trick up the Vision Pro's sleeve is that it basically supports iOS apps. You can basically throw an app into your field of vision and just look at it. It's just a normal app, but it's overlaid over whatever you're seeing. So, and Apple calls this the infinite canvas. So there's already a degree of support out the box for these things. It might not be as immersive as the dedicated, again, word, experiences that the others are going to create for it, but it's already got a fair amount of support, and that's what I think is most exciting. And again, Meta, which has been spent a lot of time building up its own things, X Stadium, Horizon Worlds, that's almost going to benefit from a halo effect. People are going to be more interested in it as a concept, because a lot of these metaverse and immersive environments haven't really gained much traction or mainstream traction. There's not many people using them. But if Apple can popularize that concept, then people think, oh, hang on a sec, this looks really interesting. I would actually like to play an immersive game, go into the social environment or watch some VR content. So that's why it's exciting, and I think that's why it's the first time that a lot of people are taking an interest in this field of immersive content.
So another example of stuff that we're like, let's keep watch and wait and see, I suppose, like we've talked about a bit with the Apple Sports app as to what is to come. Back on the Apple Sports app a little bit, again, you talked about aggregation as something that might be under happening here. We're seeing that across the entire industry, this talk about aggregation. We'll get into the joint venture news in a second, and we've already had that on the pod recently when Pat Craig's joined us. But that seems like the most viable option here. We're hearing people like ESPN talking about partners, and they've launched a JV with two other major competitors in the space. Amazon's talked heavily about being an aggregator. YouTube's being an aggregator. What play do you think Apple really has here in terms of being an aggregator in this sports streaming world we live in today?
Apple has a huge install base. It has a very engaged install base. And again, it has this ability to make its users aware of things in a way that others can't. Again, Apple releases a fairly unremarkable sports app, and it makes headlines. That's Apple's ability. It's the platform. It's this tight integration of hardware and software. It's in people's hands, and then even beyond its own devices, it's apps across platforms. So if people are using a sports app, for example, to access their scores, they might think, hang on, I want to watch that game. I don't really know where to find it. Tap, done. And they can go straight in. It can be a seamless experience. It can work with developers on the App Store. It can partner with them. It can work magic with APIs, so it's as seamless as possible. And to a degree, we're already seeing this with Apple TV. So obviously, we have Apple TV Plus, which is a subscription service, and we have Apple TV, which is the platform, which is an app for buying films and TV series from what was formerly the iTunes Store. But it also integrates with third-party apps. So in the UK, for example, I see my iPlayer programs on Apple TV. In the US, that goes a bit deeper. It integrates, I think, with things like Paramount Plus and other third-party apps. So you can get all your content in one place, particularly useful if you're an Apple TV user. So Apple could become that platform, that centralized platform, if it wants to be. And again, that becomes a selling point for iOS as an ecosystem and encourages people to buy its products. ESPN is believed to want to be that platform for sport. It's in terms of its historical branding, the nature of its first-party content, and its popular application. And it has talked about, again, effectively being not quite a TV guide for the industry, but certainly a streaming directory, a one-stop shop for both itself and others within the sports industry to solve that issue of fragmentation. There's some Roku, for example, is also wants to be that aggregator. It's got its own sport experience on its devices. So there's lots of people angling to be this. There's a recognition within the industry, among consumers, that it is just a little bit too complicated. It's not quite as simple as it once was in a pay TV world or a terrestrial world. I mean, for example, I subscribe to Sky. One of the reasons I do is because Sky Q, because I can get pretty much everything on one box. It's easy to find things. And in some markets, that role of aggregator will still be, let's say, pay TV operators. Even in France, which has shifted to, it's mainly IPTV market, France. There's not much in the way of other distribution. In the US, things are a bit more complicated because it's typically the world of digital and legacy distribution is quite separate again, which is something we've talked about a lot on StreamTime before. So Apple can be that digital aggregator. It can be that central focus. Not everyone has Apple devices, of course, in the US, but it does have quite a large part of the market. So it really, that's the possibility for Apple. It may believe that it can be that aggregating force, doesn't need to invest heavily in first-party content to be the platform of choice for the sports fan.
Well, looking at what they are doing currently in sports, and the MLS deal is the one we're always going to be pointing ourselves towards. I saw a report by Sports Business Journal that that they've suggested that MLS Season Pass, which is the product that Apple is rolling for the MLS, recorded 2 million subscribers by the end of the season. That's sounds like a good number. I have no idea, and no one else does. I think outside of Apple's four walls, even I'm not even sure the MLS does. Other than I think in the same report, Don Garber was to say they haven't reached their revenue sharing status or level yet with the subscriptions they have acquired. So for those that aren't familiar, and correct me again, Steve, if I'm wrong, because normally if you're not here, I can just bluff my way through things, but I have to make sure I actually say the right thing. Is that as part of the agreement that the MLS has with Apple, the agreement that's being covered is reportedly at the 2.5 and 10, but there is a component there of rev share once they hit a certain threshold of subscribers that's in place. So there's basically a minimum guarantee, which is quite the norm now in our industry. And then there's a revenue share, which we're seeing more and more of these days that they're aiming to. So by the end of the agreement, they're hoping that they're sharing in every single subscription that Apple is able to generate through the MLS Season Pass will be something that the MLS gets to increase their revenue and returns as a result of that. And like you said, I think Apple can basically turn on the tap they want to because they have control better than anyone as to what you're engaging with if you have an Apple device. So firstly, just I guess back to the 2 million number. I mean, what's your view? Have you looked at any research, I suppose, into some of those MLS numbers? And do you think 2 million is a good number for what they would have expected perhaps after season one, moving into season two with both the Apple relationship and indeed the Messi relationship in place? And for those that, obviously one of the parts of that deal that brought Messi to the MLS was the fact that he gets a cut of the international subscriptions they're able to generate, which is potentially very good if he's able to move the needle like they hope.
Yeah, I don't have intimate knowledge of Apple and MLS, and to know whether 2 million is a good figure. But I guess what I would say is, in what is increasingly a bit of a cutthroat rights market, 2 million subscribers, those guarantees in place, might not, with a long-term deal in place to grow that figure, it's not the worst place to be. Again, it's probably getting international revenue that it wouldn't have done before because because MLS rights were, I'd say, quite difficult to value internationally. I suppose I don't know how many subscriptions they're going to drive. And of course, in the US, I guess it might be quite difficult to figure out how they were driving subscriptions for the likes of ESPN or who had the rights previously. But 2 million seems, given that it was a good figure, given it was 1 million not so long ago. Of course, it was also worth pointing out that MLS season ticket holders do get a MLS Season Pass subscription as part of their season ticket, so there will be an element of that already preaching to the converted. But yeah, that's the beauty of a 10-year agreement. MLS will also benefit from Apple's platform. Again, I'm using that term a lot, but I mean, if we look at the app, the icon is a football field. It's not an American football. It's not a baseball. It's not anything else. That's the main iconography. It's launched around MLS time, and MLS is quite high up on the list of leagues in terms of order of how it's supported. So they'll be confident that they'll be able to reach that revenue sharing threshold by the end of the contract. Obviously, it depends what happens when Messi does leave. I'm not sure how long his current contract is, or whether there'll be an extension, or perhaps there'll be a romantic reunion in Argentina for him on the horizon. Who knows? So I think it's difficult to say at this point whether that is a good figure. I don't think it's encouraging. It's 2 million subscribers when and that they are there for MLS and nothing else. I'm afraid I can't attribute this study off the top of my head, but I was listening to someone talking about the Fox ESPN WBD streaming service, which I know we may talk about it in a bit later. But there's about 30 million diehard sports fans in the US. That's the total addressable market of people who might be interested in a combined stream product. So if there's 30 million in the US and you've got 2 million subscribers, both US internationally, that seems like a fairly decent proportion for a sport that is for all intents and purposes, it's still not among the MLS. MLS is still not among the most high profile properties in US sports. So when you put it in that context, it does seem not bad at all.
Yeah, I've heard similar number used, which is that's roughly 10% of the population. I think it's just a bit under, which is an interesting benchmark. I'd love to compare that to other markets to see if that is above or below what you see in other Western markets, given the amount of content that the US has access to across all these sports. You would think it would be as high as anywhere in the world ratio or per capita. Let's do a quick back of the fag packet workout breakdown here, and that works out. If you go to $99 a season is the season pass price, so that's just under $200 million US dollars of revenue created from the subscriptions if everyone was paying that price. But we all know that's not the case, and it's probably 2 million by the end. So if they can keep all those 2 million and keep building on that, then their run rate needs to be about 250 million of revenue to be covering the cost of what they're forking out to the MLS for those rights for Apple. Then they're not many miles off. Now, that's very top line numbers, because obviously it's costing a lot for delivering that service, and then for MLS, they could spending a lot of money on production as well. And it's like that $99 for a season pass is again probably average rate is probably going to be closer to half than it is to the full rate in terms of when you get towards the end of the season. But nonetheless, gives us a sense that it's not a million miles away from what those numbers are if they've got a 10-year runway to get there, right?
And also, this is a product that really didn't exist a little over a year ago as well. So to get 2 million subscribers from that point, I think is also perhaps something we should see as a positive, given how difficult it can be to acquire subscribers for any streaming service.
So moving on a little bit there. So I mean, obviously there's more to watch with Apple, right? Particularly there is still the big question mark around what's happening with those NBA rights, and if they are going to make a move for them. If they don't make a move for those NBA rights, then I don't really know what they're going to do unless they make a big play for someone like ESPN or make a big aggregator play like you suggested. So, I mean, we'll all be watching closely. Everyone knows that Apple can transform an industry if they really want to make a play for it. But we're all still sitting in limbo zone, I think, just for the moment until they make their next big move. But let's talk about other players and aggregators. I want to talk about Fubo. So Fubo TV, a virtual MVPD platform in the US. Incidentally, I'll be talking on stage with the CEO of Fubo TV at SportsPro New York on stage, which is I'm quite excited to. I was excited to talk to him already because I always find him an interesting conversation about their business and their investments into being a sports-first streaming platform, even though they aggregate a whole host of channels that are non-sports. And then we heard a little announcement come up around this joint venture, which really seemed to be something that could really upset their positioning as a platform, being such a this sort of the destination for a consumer to come to, where they have a whole host of different sports channels mixing through some of the partners in Fox, TNT, and with ESPN. And they've released some announcements to say they weren't very happy with the deal. I mean, we've covered some of that. You've wrote a great piece around this, Steve, and what your take is on it. And we also covered it recently with Pat Craig's on the pod as well. But since then, everyone was sort of left, I think, in the industry still, like, what's going on with this deal? Three of the biggest sports media companies in the world, definitely in the US, have come together when they've normally competitors for sports rights and competitors for attention. And now they come together for this joint venture. Well, what's happened since is that Fubo has released a lawsuit to announce that they're basically it's a lawsuit towards these three organizations. Basically, they are deeming it as being an anti-competitive move by the joint venture and the parties within the joint venture. Pretty significant to go and try and take on the big boys. And Fubo is no slouch, but it's definitely not as big as some of the other guys that it's coming up against. What was your view when you heard the announcement that they've actually launched a formal lawsuit?
I'm not really surprised at all, to be honest, because Fubo, let's face it, it's digital distribution of legacy content. And Fubo has basically position itself as the cable bundle for people who don't have cable. It's MVPDs, and that's an acronym I always struggle with. They are, for example, the only way to get ESPN and Fox via digital methods. So they're basically the bundle over the internet. And I know Fubo has positioned itself as the MVPD for sports fans. It's supplemented those channels with some exclusive content. It basically says if you like sports and you don't have cable, you come to us. Fubo would absolutely love to ditch the non-sports stuff. I'm fairly certain of that. I don't think it really wants to offer home and garden or TLC or what have you to its customers who are there for the sport. But it can't. The bundle is take it or leave it. You have to offer everything or nothing, and that means that it does have to pay carriage fees essentially, to everyone involved as part of its service, which means Fubo is subject to those negotiations, those blackouts that any cable company is. It would love to offer a cheaper, more narrow focused service that would appeal to sports fans, but that would undercut the cable companies who might say, why are we not able to do that, etc., etc. So it basically is a whole can of worms, and it's not, and that if they're able to do that. Now, this joint venture is basically doing what Fubo would like to do. It's offering the core sports services, nothing else. It will have a more affordable price point. I don't know what you've heard, but I think it's something like $50 is being touted as a potential price point, which is less than cable, certainly less than what you get on Fubo. So I guess it will, if these companies can do that, then why would someone who's ditched cable go for Fubo if they don't want things like home and garden? If they get TNT, they get ESPN. If they want the entertainment content, they can get Peacock or Paramount Plus to supplement this JV. They don't need to get those channels. So I completely understand why they've taken this legal action, because their argument centers on whether this joint venture is in effect an MVPD and whether it should be subject to the same terms. And if it is able to offer this narrow package, why can't Fubo? So I think that's what it's going to boil down to. I think is it most favored nation clause, I think is what often it's described as, one company can't have preferential terms. So yeah, I think it's a threat to the business. And also Fubo argues that if this JV has all this under its control, would it not seek to treat companies Fubo unfairly, or what Fubo perceives to be unfair terms? So not surprised this has happened, and especially not with Fubo, as you say. David Gunn he's not shy about expressing his opinions, is he?
He's certainly not shy about expressing his opinions. And looking through the lawsuit, at least the press release, I definitely have not had privy to the entire lawsuit, nor would I ever want to read an entire lawsuit. But they used words, if I can remember correctly. I am paraphrasing, so leave me alone, please, legal people, if I get this wrong. But used words as describing them as a cartel was the line that I saw published in a lot of places, which is a pretty damning way to describe people that you are currently working with. But we see a lot of negotiations now in the public when it comes to some of these deals. Some people are suggesting maybe this is a way of just trying to at least get down the rates that Fubo are having to pay on those carriage deals with some of these guys. The suggestion, if I recall, was around they're paying, they believe, so close to 30% plus on what they believe they should be paying for some of those channels that they are broadcasting on the platform by some of these organizations in the joint venture. And so that means they're getting unfair terms, and there's now a new competitor coming into the market. So it puts Fubo in a situation where they can't compete, even if they have the best interests of consumers and et cetera at heart. So they're in a rock and a hard place. So yeah, I do agree. I think there is a fair reason why they would want to come together. They would want to defend their position at all costs, not just because of their market position, but indeed if they believe that they are getting an unfair deal from some of their subscribers. And those who know and follow sort of the cable industry pretty well, that it's all built around these per channel sort of deals and prices that they have to pay to have those those channels on their respective platforms. And that's why someone like Fubo was running for so long a negative subscriber ARPU, because after they got a subscriber on for, what is it, 60, 70, $80 per month, their carriage fees would equate to more than that number, and therefore they'd be losing every time they got a subscriber on board. That's not a sustainable business model, but the objective and hope is that you can get those fees down over time as you build a more captive audience. But if you could cut that by 30%, that transforms the position of someone like Fubo from losing money per subscriber to hopefully probably gaining a nice margin when you bring the advertising revenue they bring in on the platform. So look, I'm really interested to see where this goes. It's going to cost a lot of money. Fubo's market cap, I think, I saw that there was less than $500 million through stock market conditions at the moment. Their price has dropped a lot since the peaks of, I think it was $50, $60 at the peak of the share price, and now it's down to under $2. So they have improved. If you look at their numbers, and actually their earnings call I'm going to be listening to in the coming days, since I'm in preparation for my chat with David, their numbers are looking, heading in a good direction. They're having constant growth. They're improving their margins, and he keeps saying that they're on a path to profitability in, I think, 25. So yeah, well, they're finally almost getting to that sort of those golden gates of profitability, and now they get served a pretty big curveball. So only reasonable that they would want to react accordingly. Whether they can see it through to anywhere, what would be the best result for them? My guess is a negotiation and a drop down in prices, and hopefully the JV disappears. But are they going to be the ones to see that through by themselves, or will they need perhaps some other big media companies to join the fight?
I mean, it could always just be a bargaining chip in terms of, as you say, in his negotiations. It could be that they get additional digital rights in the same way that Charter has been able to get through its dispute with Disney. It could be that they are able to get down these rights as part of a wider shift in the cable industry. And this isn't the end for the MVPD or anything like that. And even if this JV gets off the ground, they're still missing some of the bundle for sports fans. They're not going to have NBC. They're not going to have CBS. They're not going to have regional sports networks, which despite their trials and tribulations are still valued by certain audiences, particularly those hardcore sports fans, those 30 million hardcore sports fans we were talking about earlier. Again, the bundle still represents a fair bit of value for those. So it's not endgame. I think it's a bargaining chip. There is a bit of a threat to the business simply because it has ESPN and Fox, which have been the holy grail for cord cutters for so long. But even then, ESPN was going D2C 2025 anyway. Fox would eventually have to at some point, just through market shift. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see where it goes. But as I think we're both in agreement, not surprised to see it come out like this.
Indeed, and sticking with the US market for a little bit longer, one of the other players I think in the US that really took my attention first when they popped up as the broadcaster of the Live Golf series, pretty much out of nowhere, was CW, which I can't even remember what CW stands for, but what does it stand for, Steve?
Oh, it's so long ago since the merger. I know the W meant Warner Brothers, and I cannot remember what the C. Okay. It was a merger of two networks in the late 2000s, and I cannot.
Okay.
I'll be looking this up after recording, because I really want to know.
We'll look it up later and drop it in due course. But CW has been a network that seems to be slowly building out its sports portfolio with Live Golf, and then the ACC, WWE as well, and NASCAR, and also more recently, I think the Inside the NFL was the rights, I think, that they started bringing into platforms. So all of a sudden, they started to build out a nice little mix of sports rights on the platform. But from all intents and purposes, CW is mainly a linear channel, right, Steve? It's a product that hasn't been famous and synonymous with hosting a lot of live sports. And you wrote a piece around they're quite interested in making a bigger play in the sports space or continuing that momentum. Just tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I'm following CW Sports Odyssey over the last few months. I mean, for me, late 2000s, CW was my favorite US network because it had Gossip Girl and 90210, and for a brief period, WWE SmackDown. So it was great for me. But it wasn't.
What a trifecta! What a Monday night!
Oh, it feels like it was an algorithm before it was algorithm for me. So wonderful. And it still had that reputation to a degree. It was taken over by Nexstar in 2022, which operates local television stations in the US, and it acquired this broadcast network. And the president, Dennis Miller, did an interview with Axios this week, just elaborating on their sports strategy, which kind of, I don't know if it started by accident, but it was certainly been framed that way, that they were approached by Live Golf, which have been struggling to find a buyer for its media rights in the US. It desperately wanted the exposure for its project. And when it did go to the CW, there was a lot of, I guess, fun poked at it. Like, look, Live Golf, this is where they ended up. They ended up on the CW. They couldn't get anywhere else. They couldn't pay for airtime. And Miller basically said that, it kind of fell into our laps. But once we did that deal with Liv, the phone started ringing. And other sports properties said they wanted to be on the CW, because the CW, yes, it's not one of the big four networks. It doesn't quite have that same reach, but it's still a broadcast network with extremely wide footprint. And it is known in households precisely from, that Venn diagram of, I guess, of sports fans and Gossip Girl lovers, which I do find myself in the middle of. And in a world where you've got streaming services, it's becoming fragmented. You've got cable distribution is becoming less popular because people are getting rid of traditional pay TV. All of a sudden, a traditional broadcast network becomes, I guess, quite valuable in that regard. The CW, because it's an over the air network, yes, of course, it gets carriage fees from cable companies, because in the US, people still watch through cable, even if they can get it free to air. But you can get it in aerial. If it wanted to go, I guess, become a fast channel, it could, provided it had the necessary rights framework in place. So for certain properties that aren't getting those top tier broadcasters, it becomes a new route to market. And its portfolio is modest. It's not earth shattering. So its partnership with WWE is now NXT, which is the developmental brand. Inside the NFL was bounced around a few broadcasters, but was once quite prestigious, I suppose, and that's another form of programming. Then ACC, it's the college conference, it's college basketball, college football, again, not the most prestigious, but it's going to do better than other things for that slot. It's largely replaced religious and programming, advertising, teleshopping, that sort of thing. So it's surely got to be better than whatever was there in terms of audience figures for the CW, in terms of the advertising it can generate. But the CW now wants to go into primetime. It's saying it's not averse to going for primetime slots during the week, Sunday sports, for example, that it could be interested in. And that's, I guess, maybe a step up. It's not going to spend a lot of money on these things. It's not going to be its core business, but it does have $1 billion deal with NASCAR for the second series. I know it's over about 7 years or 8 years, so the cost does come down, but that's not an insignificant expenditure for a channel that really wasn't interested in sport 18 months, 2 years ago.
Yeah, it is pretty mad, the sort of levels we're talking about. But I mean, as someone who has started to watch a lot more linear TV lately, mainly because of needs must, because over here I don't have access to on my. I have a Roku, a Hisense TV with Roku on. I'm renting a house, right? And they all have the same TV in a couple of the rooms. All I can get is Netflix, Apple TV, and then there's the Digicel Plus we have the subscription to. So in terms of watching sports, it's linear or bust. They do have ESPN, the linear channel over here. So I've ended up watching loads of linear TV and a lot of live sports, which has been good. But what it's made me sort of appreciate again, because I hadn't watched a lot of linear TV for some time, is just having TV on in the background when I'm, pottering around or doing some work, or just want to put something on while I'm, navigating on my phone, checking out stuff there. Sport is so good for that. And having a platform and a channel like CW that's still investing into the space and not hiding it behind paywalls, not on a more premium platform, but has a nice little destination for sport that you can trust and rely upon, is exactly what fans and consumers really want when they're unsure of what they want to watch, right?
Yeah, I mean, we start at the top, all the sports I'm interested in. That's because I have a lot of them in the background. I like having sport on. I will watch anything. And then if it's on a mainstream broadcast channel, again, if it's CW in the US, if it's the BBC or ITV in the UK, I know other people are watching it even if they're not my core friendship, no, it feels a bit more of a moment than if it's tucked away among 200 different streams on an OTT platform. So there's definitely some value. There's definitely people that want it, and of course, not everyone's interested in streaming. I know. I think sometimes we do have a bubble in that regard. We do think everyone is cutting the cord and going over, and we have to remember, pay TV is never going to drop to zero. Linear viewing is never going to drop to zero. There's always going to be a market for it.
Yep, you've got one over here, basically based out in Jamaica. So keep it coming. It's a bit weird getting ESPN. And I'll tell you one thing about having ESPN linear that I am shocked at is how, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but all I get served in the ad breaks is more ESPN ads marketing their own stuff. And my God, it's so repetitive. I feel like I'm banging my head against the wall whenever I keep hearing the same updates again and again and again for stuff they've got on later on another day. I'm like, give it a break. Anyway, I've always wanted to talk about that since I've been moved over here because it's been doing my head in. But I digress. And in fact, I'm going to move over to another streaming platform back over in the UK. We talked about Maidstone before. We set the scene a little bit about the FA Cup. And one of the stories he published last week, Steve, I think it was last week or maybe the week before, was the FA Cup doing a deal, or the FA doing a deal with the FA Cup and TNT Sports. It seemed pretty big announcement at the time for a few different reasons. Why is this deal and this announcement so significant?
I'm going to break it down. I think there's two elements to this. So I'm going to start off with the positive bit first, and that's what it means for TNT Sports. I think this is a really good deal for TNT Sports. I think it's almost comprehensive coverage of the FA Cup. It includes every single game that isn't broadcast at 3 p.m. on a Saturday, which is subject to a blackout, which means that no football can be shown in the UK between 2:45 and 5:15 on Saturday afternoon. That's a lot of games. I think it was only 10 matches from the third round were broadcast in that slot this year in the third round. So that's a huge amount of football. I think that means they've got 22 matches to show over the course of a weekend. So you can create a weekend of football if given the schedule is staggered, so there's multiple time slots. That's really big for TNT Sport. The FA Cup has been on pay TV before, but it's always felt sort of secondary. Maybe a little bit when Sky Sports were in the picture, it wasn't quite that, but certainly since the start of the 2000s, the free-to-air partner has been the senior one, and the pay TV has been secondary. So really big for TNT. They've got their Premier League. They've got their 54 games a season sewn up for the foreseeable future. You need to have your foot in the door with that. It's what you do around that to differentiate your service, and it's basically going to be the near exclusive broadcast of the FA Cup, near exclusive broadcast of the Champions League and UEFA competitions, sharing that with Amazon moving forward. They have promised that there will be some free-to-air coverage available, and they were very pained to point that out, both the FA and TNT Sports. Now, this is where it starts to become a bit less positive on my side. We still don't know what form that is going to take. We don't know whether that's going to be whether TNT Sports will work with a free-to-air broadcaster like the BBC, as it has done for previous Olympics before the EBU deal, or whether it's going to be on TNT's own free-to-air platforms, which I think is Quest. They might have a couple of others. I'm not too attuned to that. So I think it's something like 2 matches from each round will be available on free TV, I think. Apologies if I got that wrong. The final has to be on free-to-air television as per UK government regulations. And I think that's where it starts to get a bit, gets a bit problematic. The FA Cup, it has had an identity crisis for, I guess, the last 20, 30 years, because the Premier League and the Champions League has become they've become so dominant in English football. The FA Cup, there's no denying it's not as important as it was even in the 1990s. But that's not to say it's not important. It's still got a place in the soccer landscape. It's still much coveted, and part of that reason, I think, is because it has been on free-to-air TV. At least, more, again, as I said before, the free-to-air partner was always, I guess, the senior partner, whether it was BBC or ITV. And then the last few years, it's been entirely on free-to-air TV. So it's been BBC and ITV. And I think that's been really good for the competition. It means that fans can get really invested in it. They know the biggest matches are going to be available without a subscription. It's almost like the World Cup, which is again a share between BBC and ITV, or the European Championships. It becomes a bigger event. It elevates the FA Cup in people's minds. Maidstone United was, they have been the story of this year's FA Cup, and that's not just me with my black and amber tin spectacles on. It has been a great story, and I think part of that has been because it's on BBC. Maidstone United were on Saturday lunchtime on BBC One, which is the most watched channel in the UK. And that differentiates itself from the Premier League juggernaut. It's also a lot of chances. I also think it's problematic the Premier League, because the FA Cup is a way for the biggest teams to be live in the eyes of people that don't have Sky Sports or TNT Sport. So, of course, the FA will argue that it needs the revenue to grow the game, to before its grassroots initiatives. But I'm wondering if the exposure from free TV is more beneficial in the long term, and whether going so far behind a paywall is actually going to erode the value of the asset that's just been bought. So, yeah, I think provided that we don't see that degradation in the Cup's value, I think it's a great deal for TNT Sports. I think it cements it as a really essential football service in the UK. I'm sure they do a great job with the coverage, but I do worry about the appeal of the Cup as a result, and I wonder if it's a backward step.
I mean, one of the things you've got to look at when you see a governing body, right? The FA is a governing body of sport here. Do a deal like this is you've got to understand, or you've got to look at what's the benefit here. And that's the bit I'm a bit stuck on, because ultimately the FA in this instance, they have to be not looking commercially first. They really can't. They have to be thinking about the benefits of the sport and its stakeholders. And I always get concerned when you're looking at a deal and going, that's clearly a better financial deal than you would get by going with BBC and ITV and maintaining that presence like you've just described. That is so essential for sports to have, but particularly for a sport that is for a sports competition that is so nationally vital and nationally valued by the audiences that do engage with it. So I do have that sort of concern when I see a deal like this. They've made commitments that they're going to keep it free to air. But if it's not on BBC and ITV, we lose that discoverability, right? People aren't always actively looking for the non-top tier fans who aren't going, hey, I need to find my Maidstone match. I know it's on today. Aren't going to stumble across that on Quest necessarily by accident if you're just a general consumer. And that's what being with the top public broadcasters in any market brings. It's the stumblability, which is definitely not a word, but that's what those platforms have to reach audiences that are the more casual. Someone like me who may not have a burning desire for one club, but hey, if the FA Cup was on and I stumbled across it, yeah, I'd absolutely put it on.
I think another element is the BBC's platform as well. It's not just television; it's television, radio, online. It can cross-promote that. It becomes bigger. The BBC has other departments. So, for example, the FA Cup has been promoted on Radio 1, for example, which doesn't have any sport. It's had competitions, has trailers, and it all creates something perhaps quite a lot bigger than what it could be otherwise. And if it is one or two matches, I think it's selected matches. I'm not sure I plucked the figure of two. So, but that's not really a lot for the competition. That's the breadth of the FA Cup. And my prediction is that I've got no inside information on this, that they probably will work with an established broadcaster to get these matches out there as wide as possible and to mitigate any criticism. But I'd feel a lot happier if we had a bit more information of that, in terms of how it was going to work. And I'm always a little bit skeptical of sub-licensing deals like this. I always feel like it should be, the governing body in this case perhaps should have carved out a free-to-air package, because there's also no guarantees in the quality of matches, right? Will Manchester United be on free-to-air TV? Will Liverpool be on free-to-air TV? We don't know. And it's, again, what about Discovery with their Olympic rights? They now, in terms of how they do with the EBU, it's no longer a sub-licensing deal. There is a free-to-air package carved out with the IOC. So I'm wondering if that would have been a smarter way to go and just maybe mitigate some concerns that some might have.
Yeah, it's an interesting look at how they're approaching this with the sub-licensing component, because Warner Brothers Discovery's background, you've alluded to it there, Steve, with regards to what they've done with the Olympics. Before, they had a sub-licensing or agreement where they secured all the rights and then sub-licensed to selected broadcasters in markets where they were required to have a free-to-air component. They've also done similar sub-licensing arrangements when they had the Golf Channel or the Golf TV product, where they did their deal with the PGA Tour. So they haven't been historically afraid of doing these sub-licensing deals. However, when you start giving the responsibility over to a commercial entity in this instance, then to your point, the FA loses that control to some instance, even if there is a collaborative aspect to it, that they're not going to be able to determine how much of that content is covered and broadcast on free-to-air TV, which ultimately will have an impact in reaching more casual fans.
The one precedent that I have for something like this is when, I'm not saying WD and TNT Sports are going to do this, but when the Champions League rights first became exclusive to BT Sport, TNT Sport's predecessor, there was a guarantee that one game from every match day would be available on free-to-air TV, and they set up a special terrestrial channel to show it called BT Sports Showcase. They were not the most glamorous of ties, apart from the final itself, which they put on there and also did on YouTube. So, I mean, that's a little bit different, I suppose, to the FA Cup, which is so intrinsic to British sporting culture. But it was an example of, I grew up with the Champions League on ITV. That was, Tuesdays and Wednesday nights. It came out to one game, and that was taken behind a paywall. And I do also think that the Champions League has lost a bit of appeal in the UK because it's gone entirely behind a paywall. So, I'm not saying that having the FA Cup, but it's just interesting, and I'll be keeping an eye on it.
Yeah, definitely keeping an eye on it for sure. I mean, as you said before, the FA Cup has possibly already had a bit of a challenge with its brand perception and its value in the eyes of the leagues and particularly the Premier League's top players. So it'll be interesting to see if this has even further impact moving down the line. But look, that is all we've got time for today, Steve. A big thank you again for joining us. Make sure you do, as I said, subscribe to Steve's newsletter on the SportsPro website, and also give him a follow across all the major social media channels. But look, really great to have you on board, Steve. Lots, as always, happening in this industry, and great coverage by you as always. So I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Oh, thank you very much, Nick. Pleasure.
Before you go, myself and Nick would just like to thank you for tuning into this episode of StreamTime. If you found the episode insightful, please make sure you like and subscribe on whichever platform you listen to. As a growing podcast, we'd greatly appreciate your support in sharing or writing a review. Ultimately, we want this podcast to not only entertain you, but also hopefully help you navigate the digital sports landscape. If you have any feedback on previous episodes or any topics and speakers you'd like to hear from in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find myself and Nick Meacham on LinkedIn or on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @SportsProChris1. Nick can be found @SportsProNick. Of course, if you want to stay fully up to date on the sports business news cycle, please make sure to visit the SportsPro Media website or sign up to one of our several newsletters to make sure you don't miss anything. Once again, thank you, and we look forward to you joining us next week on the StreamTime podcast.